Hey, welcome back to the channel for our long-awaited Fanatec DD1/DD2/F1 Podium Racing Wheel Bundle Force Feedback Guide for all the major sims on the market. That was quite a mouthful. Without further ado, make sure to smash the sub to stay up to date with future sim racing news, reviews, and tutorials. But for now, we're going to get straight into the feature set of the DD1, including the major settings we'll be tweaking and what they do, as well as our recommended optimized settings for every major sim on the market. Before we get stuck into the settings, it's important that you have your wheelbase operating in the correct mode in order to get the most out of this guide. It's crucial that you have your DD1 or DD2 operating in high torque mode. To enable high torque mode, you need to insert the torque key into the back of the unit. It should have come with your package. And then accept the disclaimer the wheelbase prompts you with. You must have high torque mode engaged in order for the following settings to be relevant to you. Also, please remember that different diameter wheels will dissipate FFB forces differently. My recommendations are based on using a McLaren GT3 V2 rim. If you're using something smaller, you may want to lower the FFB strength on the base, and if you're using something larger, you may want to increase it. My goal with these settings is to approximate the forces you would be getting through a hydraulic power steering rack. That is to say, we won't be aiming to exceed any more than 8 Nm of torque, and this is entirely intentional. Any more than this, and you're generally hindering your ability to drive fast rather than helping it. This has a dual-fold benefit, as it means I'll eventually be able to port over these settings to the upcoming CSL DD wheelbases, which cap out at 8 Nm. Just because a wheelbase has over 20 Nm of potential peak torque output does not mean you want to be using it regularly, if ever. Those are potentially dangerous forces with very little utility to helping your lap times. The primary reason we use direct drive wheelbases is for the quick response time and additional detail. If you want an arm workout, trust me, your local gym is more than happy to help you out. Finally, a quick primer on digital signals. Digital signals are represented through bits. The greater a signal's bit depth, the greater its resolution. For instance, a 12-bit signal can hold a potential of 4096 states. That is, if you're using the entire dynamic range of that signal. The quieter the signal, the less of that potential dynamic range is used, and the more coarse and distorted the rendering of that signal becomes. How is this relevant to us? Well, force feedback signals are digital signals. As such, we want to maintain good gain structure principles. We want to turn up our in-game force feedback signals as high as we can, shy of getting excessive, regular clipping. Some clipping will be fine, as it's a good compromise between dynamic range and keeping the bulk of the force feedback signal in a sweet spot. I'll be showing you my preferred sweet spots on a per game basis. We begin, of course, alphabetically with the ever-famous Assetto Corsa. We're here in Content Manager. If you don't have Content Manager, Soul, or Custom Shaders patch, they're absolutely critical to get first to get the best experience out of AC in the modern day, so make sure you get those first. We're in Content Manager in the Settings, Assetto Corsa, Controls, Force Feedback, Nested Menus. As you can tell, quite a few nested menus in CM. The settings themselves are extremely easy for a direct drive wheelbase, so let's begin. Gain is probably the only really consequential one, which we set down to 40%. The reason that we do that is that AC has a lot of clipping inbuilt in its default setting, and we want to avoid as much of that as possible because having a direct drive wheelbase is all about maximizing that dynamic range, making sure we get all the detail from the lowest to the highest forces. 40% with many cars will still give you some clipping on the very highest end forces, say extremely heavy damping forces at high speed on high downforce cars, or hitting very jagged vertical curbing at high speed. Beyond that, however, we maintain extremely high resolution in the mid-range while still maintaining a really good dynamic range. 40% is my preferred setting for the best of both worlds. Moving on from here, of course, we have filter and minimum force both down at 0%. We don't need these on a DD base. Effects all also at 0. These are all quote-unquote canned forces that you don't need unless you decide that you want any more of these details after we finalize our force feedback settings, so you can always circle back around to these and artificially add more of those effects for yourself. Down to miscellaneous effects, we want to make sure enhanced understeer effect is unchecked because that is one of those aforementioned canned effects. we want soft lock engaged because let's say that we're running a steering rotation of 1080 degrees, but we're driving a GT3 car that only has 540 degrees of rotation. Soft lock will allow fake end stops to kick in on our wheelbase, allowing the wheel to actually stop even when it's maxed out at 540 rather than continuing to rotate up to 1080. Going down to post-processing, we leave all of this completely off, no experimental options at all. And quickly going back to axis, you can see that I set this to 1080 degrees, which I match in my wheelbase itself. The reason that I do this is that AC auto scales to the car that you're driving, and 1080 will allow you to adequately drive, or rather accurately drive, even old school cars with very, very high degrees of rotation. There's one final setting for us to set up, and that's here in Custom Shaders patch, FFB tweaks. You want to make sure that your basic FFB tweaks are active, that McPherson strut force feedback adjustment is active, disable force feedback during loading, and finally, of course, more physically accurate gyro implementation is also active. This makes the force feedback a lot more similar to what you might find in ACC, thus unifying the two games, making the force feedback in AC a little bit more modern and a little bit more unified to what you might know. And here are our wheelbase settings for Assetto Corsa. We begin, of course, by matching the steering sensitivity, which in this case is 1080. Our force feedback strength is at 60%, though this is going to vary according to personal preference, though do bear in mind we will be tweaking it on a per car basis after this. Force feedback linearity is set to on in order to compress some of the more extreme forces and bring up some of the detail. Natural damper is set to 20, natural friction is set to 5, natural inertia is set off, and force feedback interpolation is set to 1. Force feedback intensity, force effect, spring effect, and damper effect are all at their defaults of 100. Here's how we adjust the force feedback multiplier per car in AC for absolutely perfect force feedback. Make sure to download a third-party tool which shows force feedback telemetry such as Sidekick down here. Make special note of the grey bar to the right as that's our force feedback telemetry. Take the car to an extremely high compression zone like T1 of Brands Hatch and take a look. 2 small clips at the highest downforced, highest compression part of the circuit. That means it's an absolutely perfectly dialed force feedback for our needs. Watch as we go through these mid corners and catch a few of the dips on the inside. Just shy of clipping, this means the majority of the force feedback signal is going to be in a very, very strong, highly detailed mid-range. In order to set this per car, make sure to boot up the force feedback controller that you can see up in the top left there and simply adjust the force feedback slider for the car that you're driving to keep it in the sweet spot. Moving on to the spiritual successor, Assetto Corsa Competizione. This one is arguably even easier to dial in than AC, so let's get to it. The default gain setting of 60% is nigh on perfect. The forces in ACC are a little bit more portable and self-contained, a little bit more dynamically controlled, so you won't experience much, if any, clipping whatsoever at 60%, all the while maximizing the level of most of the mid-range forces so you get a really nice high-resolution signal, thus maximizing your DD1's ultimate potential. You'll have noticed if you've ever watched one of Aris's live streams that he himself uses a DD1, so the game is pretty much dialed in specifically for our wheelbases. Minimum force, of course, once again at 0%, something you don't need on a DD base. The dynamic damping we move down to 50% from the default of 100. Why? Because I said so. No, actually one of my esports friends contacted the devs, asked them about this setting, and they actually recommended this setting for him. I tried it myself and I decided that I liked it as well, so 50% is our starting point. Road effects, 0%, again not necessary on DD1. Frequency, 330 Hz, once again because we want to maintain the maximum fidelity of the signal. The steering lock is the only place where things get down to interpretation. Now, while the steering lock in ACC, much as AC, is matched on a per car basis, one of the unfortunate things that I'm noticing is that there doesn't appear to be a soft lock setting. So for instance, if you have a steering lock set to 1080 degrees, but the car only has 540 degrees of rotation, if you spin out and the wheel starts spinning itself, long after the virtual steering wheel hits the actual soft lock, your one will continue rotating out to 1080 degrees. This can be quite frustrating if you expect yourself to be doing any kind of crazy maneuvering in a race, so I tend to set this a little bit lower. 720 degrees seems to work for me on a car-to-car basis. However, if you're more stringent, if you need it to be absolutely 1-to-1, work out what steering lock ratio your car has, and then just hard lock this to that car. And here are our wheelbase settings for ACC. We begin of course by matching the steering sensitivity, which in this case is 720 degrees. Our force feedback strength begins at 65, though this will vary according to personal preference and the car that you're driving. Because ACC doesn't have a per car force feedback adjustment, this is something we generally have to adjust on the fly. Force feedback linearity is set to on for much the same reasons as the original AC. Natural damper is set to 25, natural friction set to off, natural inertia set to off, force feedback interpolation is set to 2, force feedback intensity, force effect, spring effect, and damper effect are all at their defaults of 100. Here we are in Automobilista 2. The first question you might ask here in the force feedback menu is, why have I got the force feedback profile set to default? The reason for that is that the aftermarket profiles tend to kind of change like the wind in the community, and the default always represents the developer's intentions, so we'll go with that. We take the default gain level down to 60, affording us some additional headroom before clipping forces kick in. Low force boost we take down to 0 because being on a DD base we simply don't need this. FX I like to have down at 10 because that informs a little bit of scrubbing forces and a little bit of locking up forces into my force feedback without getting overly granular and interrupted to the experience. Damping for the moment unfortunately doesn't seem to do all that much of anything, so we'll do the majority of our damping on the wheelbase itself. The menu spring strength just applies to the centering force of the wheel in menus, and the default of 10 is absolutely fine. And here are our wheelbase settings for Automobilista 2. We begin by setting the sensitivity, which in this case is conveniently set to auto. The game will auto match for us depending on the car that we choose. Force feedback is set to 40. Force feedback linearity is set to off so we get all the transient forces. Natural damping is set to 25. Natural friction is set to off. Natural inertia is set to off. Force feedback interpolation is set to 2. Force feedback intensity is set to 100. Force effect, spring effect, and damper effect are all at their defaults of 100. Here's how we adjust per car force feedback in AMS2. It's in the vehicle setup under vehicle specific FFB. Make sure to take the car out onto the track and bring up the highest detailed telemetry the game allows. Make special note of the bar in the bottom left corner just above the word unnamed. This is our force feedback output telemetry. Take the car yet again to T1 of Brands Hatch and let's see how it behaves on a high compression corner. And the car bottoms out and it's just shy of clipping, which means we need to turn the force feedback signal strength up just a little bit more. As you can see here, a very, very strong mid-range signal during the mid-speed corners. Very good damping force and almost perfect force feedback. In this case, just needs to go up a little bit more. And now we're in the mighty beamNG. Let's go to the options, controls, force feedback, and check the x-axis. If you don't have this binding here, simply click the plus icon and add it yourself. In here, we set the filter to wheel direct, we set the steering lock type to 1:1, and we set the steering lock angle in degrees to 900. Normally, I'd be keen to set this over 2000 so the game is completely compatible with the larger vehicles such as the trucks and the buses, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to interpolate all that well to some of the older vehicles that are faster that want lower steering angles, so 900 is my happy medium. Down here at inverted axis, that's unchecked, linearity is at 1, dead zone rest is at 0, dead zone ends is at 0, and down here in the force feedback configuration we have some mildly important options, such as enabling the force feedback. The other one is inverting the force feedback. I would recommend starting with this. If the forces feel really weird and out of whack, that usually means you want to check this invert off. I would recommend starting the strength at 160 and the smoothing at 100. beamNG has extremely variable per car force feedback, so this is just a starting point, and the smoothing will help get rid of some of that low-end coarseness and grain. I would check reduce strength while parked, as well as putting 5% of side accel feedback. Side accel feedback is a lateral force that's a quote-unquote canned effect, but it can really help keep the car under control, especially if you're near the limit mid-corner. It can help you really feel where the car is at and kind of make those corrective forces if you don't have a full motion rig. Update rate limit, we max out all the way because we're good enough, we can handle it, the DD1 is great, and it feels really amazing. Update type, fast default, and that's it. Perfect DD1 force feedback in beamNG.drive. Here are our wheelbase settings for beamNG. We begin by matching the steering rotation, which is 900 degrees in this case. Force feedback strength is set to 40. Force feedback linearity is set to off so we get all the transient forces. Natural damping is set to 25. Natural friction is set to 5. Natural inertia is set to 2 in order to get around some of the very light centering forces in beamNG to make the wheel feel a little bit more connected and weighty. Force feedback interpolation is set to 2 in order to get around some of the more granular forces. Force feedback intensity, force effect, spring effect, and damper effect are all at their defaults of 100. And here's how we set per car force feedback in beamNG. Pull up the menu and then the UI selector app. Pull up the force feedback graph and place it somewhere on the screen where you can see it while driving. beamNG has immensely variable force feedback levels per car, so we'll need to use this in order to actually get a baseline level for most of the cars. Use T1 of Brands Hatch as an example as per the other sims. The idea is we want to get a slight clip down in that bottom compression as we did right there. So this car's force feedback is either perfect or just close to perfect. Maybe it needs to be dialed back just a tiny little bit. As we can see, through the mid-speed corners, the force feedback levels are very high and healthy, but with no clipping. This means that we're very, very close to the sweet spot. Now, if we want to save this, we want to pull over, press Ctrl W to bring up the setup menu, go to the tuning submenu, and then set the setup specific force feedback multiplier to where we want it. And then make sure to go to save and load and save this preset for future use. The grand exception here is iRacing. As I've never once driven an iRacing, it would be crazy for me to give you any settings for its force feedback. So I did the very next best thing. I asked some of my industry colleagues to give me their recommended settings, to which I got the response that iRacing is extremely car dependent. As a result, for iRacing specific force feedback settings, you're better off watching this video by my buddy Will about how to use the auto calibrate feature in order to get perfect iRacing force feedback. The video is linked in the card above as well as in the description down below. Remember that we have a common baseline starting point for most of these sims in order to maximize the sweet spot of the force feedback signal. As a result, I would suggest defaulting the wheelbase to a force feedback strength of 50 with linearity set to on, a natural damping setting of 25, natural friction and natural inertia to 0 with interpolation set to 1. Use this as your starting point, and with Will's video as your iRacing specific guide, tweak from there to find your ideal sweet spot. The mighty RaceRoom, back with a bang with a brand new physically based force feedback engine written from the ground up. Bear in mind that this guide does not apply to any version of RaceRoom prior to June of 2021. We start here in the Essentials section. I would highly recommend turning the force feedback on before proceeding. We also invert the force feedback for the DD1. Here in the physics-based section, we have the crux of the settings. The force feedback strength is the setting that we know and love from all the other sims, except in the case of RaceRoom, we get a fun little pictogram on the right showing us what that actually means to the signal. I would recommend keeping the FFB strength at the max of 100, which maximizes the dynamic range and the signal fidelity, which we can then turn down to tailor our wheelbase after the fact. Force feedback linearity we're going to keep at 100% because we'll be turning this on the wheelbase. Force feedback minimum force, just like all the other sims, we keep completely off because this is not a setting intended for direct drive wheelbases. FFB maximum force is a very unique setting to RaceRoom, which allows you to artificially clip certain forces. So let's say that there's a certain arm tearing force happening with one particular car on one particular track or one particular corner. You can choose to clip that force so it's a little bit less jarring for you. Otherwise, I would recommend keeping this at 100%. Stationary friction at the defaults of 50% I find to be absolutely fine. Down here in the immersion section, aka the CAN section, we have engine vibrations, bump amplification, and gear shift effects. I keep everything off other than gear shift effects, which I keep at 15% because, let's face it, gear shift effects are freaking awesome and super immersive. Whether or not they're realistic or not, it feels amazing. Jack them up, have some fun. And here are our wheelbase settings for RaceRoom. We begin by matching the steering sensitivity, which in this case is of course auto. The game will automatically adjust on a per car basis. Force feedback strength is 50. Force feedback linearity is set to on in order to compress some of the more drastic forces and bring up some of the lower detail. Natural damping is set to 25. Natural friction is off. Natural inertia is off. Force feedback interpolation is set to 1. Force feedback intensity, force effect, spring effect, and damper effect are all at their defaults of 100. And here's how we set up per car force feedback in RaceRoom Race Experience. Make sure to bind keys to the force feedback multiplier as well as the force feedback meter. The force feedback meter can be brought up with this key binding, as you can see in the bottom of my screen here. Very detailed, amazing graph for fine-tuning our FFB to complete perfection. Once again, take the car to T1 of Brands Hatch and wait to see what it does under high compression. 2 small clips almost exactly like AC when we started this guide, which means this force feedback for this car is in the absolute perfect spot. Watch as the meter meters a signal in the mid to high mid-range during these mid-speed corners. That means our force feedback is dialed to absolute perfection. Aim for this kind of behavior per car when you're running RaceRoom yourself. rFactor 2, possibly one of the most challenging sims to set a hard and fast force feedback rule for. The reason for this is that rFactor contains content made over a vast span of time by various different developers. As such, force feedback ranges from extremely smooth to coarse and granular, so we have to learn what these settings mean because we'll be tweaking them on a per car basis. The force feedback type is of course set to wheel for us. The smoothing, in my case, I dialed for the recent BMW M4 DTM car, and I found about 5 or 6 was great for that one. Generally, smoothing can range anywhere from 1 all the way up until about 8 or so, depending on how coarse and granular the force feedback actually is. You'll have to dial this on a per car basis. The car-specific multiplier is basically the force feedback strength on a per car level. rFactor does not have a global force feedback strength setting you can alter in the menu. The way that I like to assign this is by using a global calibration point. You would have noticed so far that I tend to default to a force feedback strength on my wheelbase of around 38% if linearity is set to on. I tend to set this on in rFactor and then dial each car to correspond with that to get even forces across the board. This for me gives the most uniform starting point. Minimum steering torque is a setting not made for direct drive wheelbases. Much like minimum force, it's not something we need to worry about. Keep it at 0. The steering wheel range is one of the more annoying prospects. Back in the day, rFactor could support the auto sensitivity from the DD1, which would automatically adjust the wheel to the steering lock of the particular car that you were driving. Ever since an update broke this, it's not actually been fixed, so you have to work out what the steering wheel range of the car that you're driving is, and then set it manually on the wheelbase itself. This is of course if you have vehicle set, checked here. And here are our wheelbase settings for rFactor 2. We begin by matching the steering wheel rotation on a per car basis. Make sure to check the car's steering wheel rotations in-game and match it on the wheelbase. Force feedback strength begins at 50, but this is going to depend per taste. Force feedback linearity is set to on in order to compress some of the more drastic forces. Natural damping is set to 25. Natural friction is at 3. Natural inertia is off. Force feedback interpolation is at 1 because we do the majority of our smoothing in the software. Force feedback intensity is at 100, force effect is at 100, spring effect is off, and damper effect is off. And that's it, my recommended DD1 settings for all major modern sims. I hope this has helped you shortcut the sometimes very hectic tweaking process that most simulators force us through. These are the settings I've arrived at after using my DD1 for over a year. I believe they're founded on a solid logical basis, and moreover, they feel very good to me. Bear in mind, however, that there are some variables here which may require you to tweak the settings to your circumstances. In this section, we'll go over what those are. If you try one of these settings and immediately get hit with the feeling of, this just isn't right, make sure to double check that you've set both your in-game and wheelbase settings exactly as I did. This includes, of course, using the high torque mode on your wheelbase, which requires that you insert the torque key into the back of it. After this, simply tweak the FFB strength on your wheelbase to get it in the sweet spot for you. Different wheel rims require different amounts of force to feel right. A simple strength adjustment should be all that's required to tailor these profiles to most situations. If you're finding that the FFB is interfering too much with your driving or hampering your hot lap times, my recommendation would be to first lower the in-game smoothing, then the interpolation on the wheelbase. If this isn't enough, then lower the natural damper setting, as well as the natural friction and natural inertia. These will remove delay between yourself and the forces, but transmit them in a way that's more coarse. Finally, if you'd like to see a similar guide made for the more popular and less niche racing games on the market, such as Dirt Rally, F1 2021, and other titles such as that, do let me know in the comments down below. Well, I sincerely hope that this video was helpful to you guys and you get a whole new level of enjoyment out of your favorite sims. If you want to support the channel, make sure to subscribe to stay up to date with future sim racing news, reviews, and tutorials. If you want to support us more directly, consider taking the Fanatec affiliate links down below and checking out their ecosystem. In the meantime, leave your comments down below, let me know what you want to see on this channel in the future, and until then, I'll see you guys later.